Hey, everybody. Welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have Miles Taylor back with us today. We'll chat with Miles in just a moment. But first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So Miles Taylor is a national security expert, New York Times bestselling author, and co-founder of Defiance.org. He previously served as chief of staff at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, where he published a bombshell anonymous essay in the New York Times, blowing the whistle on presidential misconduct. He later published the #1 bestseller, A Warning, revealed himself to be the author, and launched a campaign of ex-officials to oppose Donald Trump's reelection. He's worked as an advisor in the George W. Bush administration, on Capitol Hill, as a CNN contributor, and is the co-founder of a DC-based charter school and multiple democracy reform groups. He is also the author of the New York Times best-selling book Blowback and the host of the iHeartRadio podcast, The Whistleblowers. Miles, welcome back into the back room.
Great to be with you, my friend.
So, Lindsey Graham, today's his funeral. I just saw a little while ago that Donald Trump is going to be one of the people eulogizing him, which I want to ask you about in a second. But you worked in the White House. What kind of memories do you have of Lindsey Graham?
Well, I also worked with Graham on Capitol Hill. And I'll tell you, I worked with two different men, two very different men. There was before Trump the president and after Trump the president. And two totally different Lindsey Grahams. The Lindsey Graham before Donald Trump became president, whether you loved him or hate him, was committed to the conservative cause. And on foreign policy, for someone like me that came out of the Bush administration, I saw him as tough and principled. He built a whole brand on being principled and also willing to work across the aisle to put together deals with his former friend and my former mentor, Senator John McCain. The Lindsey Graham after Donald Trump became president torched his principles, lit them on fire in front of the world because he was forced to contradict everything he'd said about Donald Trump, all the warnings he'd made about Donald Trump when he became an obvious Trump supplicant. And you could peel back the layers of that onion for years, but ultimately you're going to come to the same conclusion. The man wanted to stay relevant, and he saw the only way to stay relevant as developing a close relationship with the man he warned was a would-be despot, Donald Trump. And I got to tell you, it was a humiliating thing to watch. And on the inside of the Trump administration, there was a lot of us who wondered why Lindsey Graham took this approach when his good friend John McCain took the other approach, which was to stay committed to his principles, to continue to criticize Trump where he deserved criticism, even though both men were Republicans and Trump was now the head of the Republican Party. You could not have created a better experiment in a petri dish than that, how McCain and Graham responded to the Trump presidency. And unfortunately, I think Lindsey Graham ended up enabling and bringing to fruition the very thing he warned most stridently about, and that was a strong man in the White House.
Do you think it's okay when somebody passes to just be honest with who they were or what they became and not whitewash somebody's history?
Yeah, look, I don't think when someone dies, we have a responsibility, all of us, to eulogize them. We don't have to all eulogize them. Now, I think the thing that is appropriate is I don't think we should become ghouls in their death and stomp on their graves just to make a point. That's what Donald Trump does. In fact, that's exactly what Donald Trump did to U.S. Senator John McCain. In fact, it's one of the reasons why I ended up breaking with Trump, writing the op-ed from within his administration, sounding the alarm on his misconduct, is all of that played out the night that I got a phone call asking me to raise the American flags back up that had been lowered to half-staff in honor of John McCain. And that's because Donald Trump could not bear the fact that John McCain was being honored across the country. I was so disgusted by that I felt like people needed to know the truth. They needed to know how bad it was inside the administration. Fast forward And what an irony it is that that same man is now going to be eulogizing Lindsey Graham, a former friend of John McCain. And I think that says a lot. Again, we don't all have to eulogize Lindsey Graham, but I hope folks won't do what Donald Trump did, which was act ghoulish and, act like, the petty man that he is. We can still be honest about Graham's legacy without celebrating and excitedly encouraging the deaths of our adversaries. That's what Trump does. And we're better than him, and we're bigger than him. And, I will say, Lindsey Graham, none of us needed to do anything for Lindsey Graham to experience karma in this world. The fact that he ended his career licking the boots of an autocrat is all the karma Lindsey Graham needed.
And to your point, who can forget what Trump said after Robert Mueller died? I'm glad
Absolutely.
He's dead. I mean, that was just crazy. And speaking of Trump's eulogy this afternoon of Lindsey Graham, what are the odds of that actually being a eulogy and not a Trump rally?
I'm so glad you said it. And again, I will say, this is likely to be the final humiliation for Lindsey Graham. And that's why he doesn't need any of us to bring him karma. There's no use in us going above and beyond to torch Lindsey Graham in death. It's all happening because it is likely that this man, Donald Trump, will make a very good portion of that eulogy about him, about Donald Trump. That's the capstone on Lindsey Graham's career. This is what happens when you throw away your career in cowardice. This is what happens when you capitulate. Your reputation gets stained forever, and the person etching your name into the stone is the person you spent so many years fighting against, so many years warning the American people about. And I think it's just very sad to see. I honestly hope, Andy, that a lot of the U.S. senators that are sitting in that audience at that funeral will take a chance to reflect on that. Do they want to be the John McCains of the world who pass in dignity with their principles held upright, or do they want to be the Lindsey Grahams to capitulate, to go spineless, and to watch their foe preside over their funeral? Do they want that? Because that's what they'll get if they continue to say one thing in private about what they believe and do another in public.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point. And one would think that if Trump does exhibit his worst tendencies during this eulogy, if he does start yakking about 2020 and fake news and Canadian smoke and all the ridiculous things that he is capable of talking about, I would hope that those same senators sitting there would look at that and go, or at least a part of them would be like, I'm done. This guy can't even, there's something wrong with him. But my sense is that somebody wrote him a nice eulogy. It's going to be on a teleprompter. We know that Trump can't help himself, so he will go off prompter. If I was going into my Trump brain mode, I'd be like, Lindsey Graham was a great guy. He did this, he did that. Such a great guy. Wasn't like the best. Like, that's when he'd go off. He'd be like, you're not the best guy. Couldn't do this. He was loyal, but not too loyal to Trump. He'll go off on and then he'll come back to the prompter where he sounds semi-normal. And it's just, I can't, it's hard to imagine it not being anything but a disaster. On any level.
There's a reason why at a lot of these major state funerals the past few years, you have seen Donald Trump not included on the invitation lists, whether it was the John McCains or the Dick Cheneys or others who've passed. Folks don't want him there, both symbolically and actually, because they don't want that type of person at the microphone in a moment when someone who is deceased is meant to be honored and memorialized. So, look, I'd agree with you, Andy. Can't predict what he's going to say, but we have a lot of past episodes of Donald Trump to go off of, and I'm sure that he'll be sending Lindsey Graham off in some measure of disgrace.
Yeah. Well, Donald Trump is not a man who's known to bring compassion and empathy to a funeral, so it's probably going to be ugly on some level. Let's talk about two meetings that he's having today. One with Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, and the other with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. What are you expecting to come from these meetings, if anything?
Well, look, Donald Trump is nothing if not impressionable. And that's what I would expect out of the meeting with Netanyahu. I've met with Netanyahu multiple times in his office in Israel. And I can tell you, the man, also, love him or hate him, the man is a master of statecraft and a master manipulator. I have watched him take strong-willed members of Congress and wrap them very slowly around his finger. Why? Because he's almost always the man in the room who has greater command of the facts and of history and who has the most persuasive demeanor. He just is. There's a reason why he has survived the ages in Israeli politics, is he's a force of nature. And Donald Trump wilts pretty easily in the face of forceful strongman types. And that's how he, I suspect, was persuaded by Benjamin Netanyahu to get into this conflict with the Iranians. And I would guess that he leaves that meeting today more resolved to end this war on Israel's terms rather than America's terms. Now, that may or may not be visible in the immediate, but if there are issues on which Donald Trump is on the fence about whether to continue the conflict or how to resolve the conflict, you can bet that Benjamin Netanyahu is going to push him over onto the side of the fence that he wants Trump to fall, and Trump will show no resistance.
Give us an example of what those issues for Israel might be.
Well, for Israel, it would be gaining greater leverage right now. The Israelis are very worried that this conflict gets ended by the United States too early, before there's further degradation of the regime, before there's further degradation of the Iranian nuclear program, before we've located the new leaders of the regime, and before there has been more effort undertaken to deny the Iranians the ability to threaten regional countries like the Israelis, like our Gulf state partners. The Israelis would really like to see, in my estimation, one more big push, a major push to degrade Iranian infrastructure. If they can exact that concession, they'll argue to Donald Trump, you'll leave the region safer and you're going to get more leverage in these negotiations. Now, I would argue that's probably not true, because what is unspoken here is that the Iranians have the Russians and the Chinese secretly backing them up. They have been told by their superpower partners, you can continue, you can keep fighting, bleed the Americans dry, we will help you. So it's not as simple as the Israelis are going to want Donald Trump to think. But that's my guess, is they're going to want to convince Trump to go harder one more time. And Trump knows it, by the way. Last week, Trump even said that he was considering a massive attack on Iran, the type of attack that he said the Israelis would join him in 2 seconds if he asked. Andy, this was another wink nod towards nuclear weapons. This is the same man in April who threatened a whole civilization will die. Every time he talks about the big one coming to Iran, he's talking about some kind of nuclear engagement. So Trump thinks in his head already that the Israelis want him to do more. He's susceptible to that manipulation. And I suspect if Netanyahu has his way, Donald Trump will commit in that meeting to go harder at least one more time. Now, the effect of that might not be to end this war. It might actually be to send it spiraling further and continuing it into the medium term.
Well, that's the interesting speculation, because we know that this war is hugely unpopular with the American people. We know that it's not very popular with Congress, in particular, Republican Congress people who are facing reelection in 3 months from now. That move, that kind of escalation, just from a political standpoint, would seem disastrous, without even guaranteeing the success of it militarily or subsequently diplomatically. So do you think he has the balls to do that? See, I just think he's a big coward. His threats are always empty. You know, he's Taco Boy. He never really acts on his threats. And I think that's given the Iranians more leverage than anything, perhaps.
Yes, I would say most of the time. But then there's the 10% of the time Donald Trump can be emotively and impulsively convinced to burst into the China shop, throw his weight at the shelves, break everything, and then walk out and say, it wasn't my fault. It was the people who built the China shop in the first place. That's what I worry about. That's how he got into the Iran war in the first place. That's why folks in the first term who I worked with were worried about him getting into the Iran war, is we thought it wasn't well reasoned from the get-go, that Donald Trump really didn't have a plan, that if he did it, it would do more harm than good, and that we needed to keep him from impulsively taking us into a conflict. There needed to be more planning. There needed to be more strategy. And here we go into a second term. Donald Trump, a year in, is convinced suddenly to throw the United States into this conflict that, again, he sees in his mind could end within weeks, but any other seasoned observer could have told him this will drag on months at best. There's no way you're going to achieve what you want to achieve within weeks. And sure enough, that happened. So I still think it's very possible, even though Trump has chickened out again and again and again on his threats to Iran, he could be persuaded to impulsively do something dramatic and stupid and irreversible, including, God forbid, the remote possibility that he breaks the nuclear taboo for the first time in decades. This is a man, Andy, who has fantasized about using nukes since I worked in his first administration. And that sounds very hyperbolic and alarmist, but I'm just reporting to you what I saw inside that administration, which is a Trump that seemed eager to use nukes, a Trump that queried aides why he couldn't use nuclear weapons, a Donald Trump that asked his White House chief of staff, John Kelly, why we couldn't just nuke the North Koreans, a Donald Trump who we had to be warned might accidentally get us into a nuclear war, so much so that the Defense Secretary Jim Mattis asked us at the Department of Homeland Security to prepare as if the president was going to get us in the first two-sided nuclear conflict in world history. We did the first live fire exercises DHS has ever done to prepare the American homeland for that possibility. That's how scary it was. And now this man's president again. And now he's got a stupider team, more willing to comply with what he wants, and he's got his finger on that red button. Do I think it's the likeliest possibility? No. But I worry very much about this guy getting us onto that slippery slope that ends up in some sort of unimaginable nuclear event.
You know, you were in the room. I wasn't in the room. Most of us are not in the room. So how much of that is performative? Oh, can we use nukes on North Korea? Blah, blah, blah. You know, he's such a coward that he loves to talk tough. Do you really believe in your heart of hearts that he has it within himself to take that kind of a step?
Well, it's less so entirely in his control. That's what I worry about. Donald Trump's performative nature and his theatrics have a way of becoming policy, whether they are intentional or not. Because once you start to put signals out in the world, you're not the only player acting in a vacuum. Other players act. And that's what Jim Mattis was worried about with the North Koreans, is when Trump started threatening fire and fury in his tweets. Sure, maybe Donald Trump thought that was performative, but you had a leader in a reclusive hermit kingdom that did not think it was performative, and who had his own weapons, and who had his own willingness and incentives potentially to take preemptive action to defend his country. That's what I worry about with Donald Trump. Yeah. All of his bluster can create the types of conditions we see in global conflict where a misunderstanding and misstatements lead to what you call security spirals. And one side starts acting in anticipation that another side is going to do something hostile to them. And all of a sudden, you're mired in a much more dangerous situation than you ever envisioned. This is the classic story of how World War II, started through a chain reaction. World War I through a certain set of chain reactions. This is what Donald Trump can't control. And that's why his demeanor is more reckless than people even realize.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it's kind of the antithesis to mutually assured destruction, you know?
That's right. It's in Donald Trump's world, it's almost assured destruction if he doesn't, at turns, repress his desires, or if there are not people around him willing to talk him out of illegal, unethical, and immoral actions.
Yeah. What about his meeting with Zelensky? We're years into this war. Maybe he's starting to feel like, you know how Donald Trump loves to pick winners. He almost to the point of like endorsing two people in the same race so he can't lose, which is kind of psychotic, actually, and genius when you think about it, But so it seems like the tide is turning a little bit. Ukraine is starting to gain the upper hand. Maybe he sees that. Well, we about to enter a phase where Trump is siding with Ukraine, siding with Zelensky more than we have seen in the past. What could come out of that meeting?
Well, that's one of those where I don't see the likelihood of major changes in Ukraine policy. Iran is different because Donald Trump has already gone on the offensive against the Iranians, and he seems to be searching for anyone to validate the notion that this was worth it. So Netanyahu showing up and saying it was worth it, and here's how you can win, can change what Trump does in that conflict. On Ukraine, Trump is always going to be torn between his apparent loyalty to Moscow and a conflict that his government, predating his arrival, is already invested in. And Andy, I think you point to something very incisive, which is that Donald Trump doesn't ever want to be disassociated from the winner. He always wants a tie to the winner. And so what will look different is this Ukraine meeting versus the last one Zelensky had with Donald Trump in the Oval Office, where they told Zelensky to his face, you don't have any of the cards. You have none of the cards. And Zelensky gets to come back into Washington and show, yeah, I didn't have the cards. Look what's happened since. And I think you're right. Donald Trump is going to want to say positive things. He's going to want to laud him, because if Zelensky ends up turning the tide of this thing largely on his own, no thanks to an extra push from Donald Trump, Trump's going to want to take credit for it. And he's going to want to take credit that he helped the Ukrainians get to a place where they had the leverage to end the war. So I do think on whole, this is probably a good visit for Zelensky, but he should not expect the Trump administration to make the types of commitments the Ukrainians need them to make to win this war decisively and to push the Russians out. Now, let me point to a big irony here, folks. Here's the big irony. Right now, the United States is supporting Ukraine in a conflict that could help us deeply weaken one of our gravest adversaries, the Russians. But Donald Trump has shown a lot of restraint. He doesn't want to do that. On the other hand, our adversaries, the Russians, are reported to be actively helping the Iranians target and kill Americans and want to use our engagement in Iran to weaken us. If Donald Trump would just open his eyes to that, he might be able to solve both conflicts.
Well, it's no different when, you ask, why isn't he prosecuting Epstein pedophiles? We know the answer to that. So it's almost his tell. Like when he doesn't do the right thing, you know he's entrenched to the point of his own guilt on some level, and that all the rumors about him relating to that particular situation are probably true. The last time you were on here was about 6 months or so ago. Where do you see Trump and his presidency at this point? Do you see him as having more effective guardrails placed on him, the courts holding back his worst tendencies? Do you see Congress starting to turn on him a little bit? Do you see him more powerful, more brazen? Where are you on Trump as we head into August?
More powerful and more brazen and more weakened than ever. And those things, unfortunately, are mutually reinforcing. The further Donald Trump gets backed into a corner, the harder he swings his fist. Let me say the thing that wasn't the case 6 months ago, which is that Donald Trump has lost millions, if not tens of millions, of his supporters. Statistically, this is the extraordinary development so far in the second term. Donald Trump is hovering right now around a low 30% approval rating in the United States. Let me tell you how that's possible. Donald Trump came into the White House with a roughly 52% approval rating, roughly half the country behind him. Most of that is his Republican base and a good chunk of independent voters. Then he went down to about 40%. For that to happen, Trump needed to lose a lot of those independents, and he hovered there for a while. The only way for him to have reached the level he's at in the low 30s required MAGA people, voters who voted for him 3 times for the presidency, to leave, to defect, to say they can no longer support Donald Trump. And that dip from 40% to 30%, again, can literally be measured in the millions of supporters who have broken away from him, largely because of 2 things: the Epstein files and the Iran war. Those 2 things together, if you look in the crosstabs of the surveys, have convinced a lot of his supporters that he has betrayed his promises and cannot be trusted. Both of those things, forever wars and exposing the cover-up of the Epstein conspiracy, were things that he talked about extensively on the campaign trail. It's done him extraordinary damage. And yet, Andy...
What about affordability? Don't
Well,
they
look,
feel
I mean,
betrayed on that? Every time they go to the gas pump, the supermarket?
I think at the core of it, you always have economic considerations driving voter behavior. And that's where I think his supporters have been willing to see what all of us have seen since he came back to office, is that Donald Trump is deliberately making decisions that make their lives more difficult. And the Iran conflict woke a lot of them up on that. You saw the Trump movement, many of them in denial about his handling of the economy for his first year back in office. And a lot of those surveys, Republicans were giving him very high marks on the economy. But then it took him breaking the seal, breaking one of his promises, going to war, for them to say, well, wait a second. Now prices really are going up everywhere. I see the price on a billboard at every single gas pump. And he broke his promise to me. That has resulted in his numbers on the economy cratering.
What's worse, that's, I think what you just said is true, but at the same time, he's telling them that everything has come down. And they're seeing those numbers, and they're holding the pump, holding their credit card and going, what is this motherfucker talking about? Like, I'm paying way more than I've ever paid. Nothing's going down.
Yeah. And I think that voters... it's been a very rude awakening for a lot of MAGA voters. And look, you see it with the, if you want to call them the MAGA elites, the influencers that, the podcast bros that helped Donald Trump get to the White House. So many of them have distanced themselves from this administration. And it's sort of the tip of the iceberg of what's happening with voters. Andy, I was glad you also had mentioned the Epstein files, because this is something we see as a major wedge issue going into the midterms, is that all voters, but especially MAGA voters, see this as one of the ultimate betrayals. This week, our organization, Defiance.org, is going to be announcing in front of the United States Capitol with a dozen Epstein survivors that we are putting all 3.5 million Epstein files on the road through the midterms. We outfitted a truck into a mobile museum that's going to go to communities all around the country with survivors to keep the spotlight on this issue, because we know it's one of the most powerful wedge issues to shine a light on corruption in this administration. Multiple members of Congress will be there to announce that. And of anything that we saw that could reach people looking at the surveys, to us, it was this. It was this issue. It was justice for survivors. It was demands for accountability. And people, even if they love Donald Trump, have a really hard time explaining why foreign governments like the French and the British continue to investigate these pedophiles, but the United States has stopped investigating them. And it's sort of like their software breaks down when confronted with that information. There's no other conclusion other than the U.S. government is covering this up. We have to do something about that. So we'll be out there, folks. If they want to go check out the tour, this is free to anyone in any city this goes to. They can go to TrumpEpsteinBookmobile.com. It's TrumpEpsteinBookmobile.com, and you'll be able to track where the truck is going. You'll be able to go visit it. You'll be able to see the files. You'll be able to meet with survivors, and you'll be able to raise awareness about the need for justice.
Yeah, well, what we're going to do here is take a look at that tour schedule, and we'll promote wherever you're going to be so that people...
We're going to need Andy as a celebrity driver of the truck. Just so you know, Andy, some of our mutual friends in Hollywood have agreed to be drivers of that truck between locations and to make appearances. So
as long as
that'll be
it's not a
traveling the
standard
country for months.
transmission, I'm in.
It's automatic.
As long as it's not a standard transmission, I'm in.
Good.
So how likely do you think that a good percentage of MAGA is at the point now where they're like, maybe that wall has started to crack and crumble in the way you're talking about with a good chunk of his
don't
base?
just think
they're finally seeing through the lies and the gaslighting?
Yeah, there was a survey that came out the other week that shows a remarkable enthusiasm gap between Democratic and Republican voters. And there's a number of reasons for that enthusiasm gap. So look, here's the amazing thing, Andy, is Donald Trump is mounting the biggest get out the vote operation in American history. Unfortunately for him, he's doing it for the other side of the aisle. Data right now shows that there's a double-digit enthusiasm gap. Democrats are far more likely to say that this is the most important midterm election in their lifetimes, and Republicans are more likely to say that they're going to stay home, that they don't want to go vote. Now, this is twofold. The reasons for this are twofold. One is Trump has convinced Democrats that he is hell-bent on stealing their democratic right to vote. And you see 3 in 4 Democrats now say this is the most important election in their lifetimes. And then on the other side, Trump is unintentionally suppressing the vote on his side of the aisle. If you remember in 2024, he said, if you elect me, you'll never have to vote again. And unfortunately, Andy, it looks like, based on the surveys, his voters took him seriously because Republicans, many of them are talking about not voting this fall. And just remember, weeks ago, Donald Trump told them that if he passes his voter suppression schemes, Republicans won't lose a race for 100 years. So the message you're getting if you're a MAGA voter is, hey, don't worry about it. The president's got it covered. He's going to make sure we win. You don't have to do anything. And they are listening.
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting subject because it's easy for folks at home to go, oh, my God, look at what he's doing. He's going to steal the election. It's just not going to matter, blah, blah, blah. Maybe you could help people understand how complicated it would be to have a multi-state stolen election. Especially when you factor in his incompetence to the tune of what you just talked about. But he's actually negatively impacting his own party's chances.
Well, there are 2 different things here. And one is the actual votes themselves. And will it be a free and fair election where people are able to cast their vote and have it recorded legitimately? And then there's the perception around whether it's stolen. The first, I am more than certain that this will be an election where people are able to go cast their vote, cast it legitimately, and if the political opposition wins, they will win on paper. I am equally as certain that Donald Trump will attempt to contest that election. He will attempt to obscure the legitimate results, and he will use every power available to him to prevent the peaceful transfer of power if Democrats retake the Congress. That might have sounded crazy 5 or 6 years ago. Then we saw Donald Trump try to steal a presidential election. But here's the thing. The difference between now and last time is we see it coming. States attorneys general, secretaries of state, election officials around this country, they see the danger. They see that Donald Trump is trying to meddle in the elections, and they are taking efforts to try to protect those elections that they were unable to take in 2020. That's what gives me a little bit of heart, is that, yeah, we know Donald Trump is going to try to meddle in this thing. He's going to try to muck up the results, but the states and the locals who administer elections are ready to fight.
I hope that you are correct, that they see this coming and they are more than prepared for whatever Trump throws at them. I'm a little concerned about day of chaos, so that's why I tell people vote early, vote by mail, just try to minimize the amount of turnout that takes place on Election Day. Miles, appreciate the insights, and come back again soon.
Andy, thanks, my friend.
All righty, take care. This episode was produced and edited by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud for Radio Free Rhinecliff, with additional editing by Maddie Rosenberg, music by Andrew Hollander, and graphic design by Cricket Lengale. And with a special thanks to our sponsor, The Epicurean. Again, thanks for listening. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the Backroom with Andy Ostroy YouTube channel, where you can watch full videos of our interviews. See you next time.